Dave Palumbo here with another RX Muscle rant. Today's topic is going to be what makes a good interview. And I'm going to use this as an example, this past weekend's Mr. Olympia contest. And I want to start off by saying, congratulations to Sean Roden on a great victory. And also I want to say, I can only imagine what Phil Heath, seven-time Mr. Olympia is feeling right now. It's got to be, hurting. No one wants to lose, especially an existing champion who's at the, the peak of his powers. So for that, I say, I can relate and I completely sympathize with your plight, and I'm sure Phil will be back next year. Now, having said that, what makes a good interview? Phil did a day after, seminar, Olympia seminar, the day after his loss on Sunday, and he was, a couple of people videotaped him, I guess, answering some questions, and one of the topics that he addressed was the fact that he thinks that we're upset with him because he denied doing an interview with us after we had requested it, and I guess he had done one with a few different media organizations. And the truth is, I was disappointed in the sense that he didn't do it, but not, I didn't lose any sleep over it. But his it's funny, his reason for not doing the interview was that he felt the questions were inappropriate. Now, interestingly, I usually never, agree to give my questions ahead of time that I'm going to ask someone in an interview because it ruins the spontaneity of the interview. But because he is seven-time Mr. Olympia, I never interviewed him before, and aside from talking to him a couple times here and there, I figured I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and I'd give him the questions so that he wouldn't feel like, I was trying to sandbag him or anything like that. Because I wanted him to see what I wanted to ask. And as any of you guys have watched my interviews, I believe the key to a good interview is getting to the root of who the person is. Finding out what makes that person tick. And people don't really know what makes Phil Heath tick because we've never heard an interview that was really delving into his persona, of who he is, where he came from. Because that's what makes a person, after all. Your childhood, your upbringing, what you've been exposed to environmentally. We did a great interview with Jose Raymond where he completely opened up to us about how he was raised in foster care. His natural-born parents were not great parents. It was him and his brother Tito endured a lot. And that interview was so endearing, I think, and it enabled people to relate to Jose on such a deep level that I think people have a newfound appreciation for him. Now, Jose's an open book anyway, so people kind of relate to him anyway, but this even gave a greater appreciation for what his accomplishments were. So I sent Phil some questions, all the questions, as a matter of fact, I was going to ask him, even extra ones that maybe I wasn't going to ask him because I didn't know. I never know what I'm going to ask someone. A great interviewer goes with the flow of what the conversation is. You don't just start reading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is what most people do. Otherwise, there's no continuity. You follow up on what's being said. You have to listen to what the person answers. If you don't listen and you're just reading questions because you're nervous or because you don't really care, then that's not going to be a good interview. So he obviously turned down the interview, and he obviously didn't really say too much to me why he turned it down, other than he didn't like the questions. But in this post-Olympia, appearance he made, he said that he was like cackling, almost like, how dare I ask him these questions? And one of the questions was, what were the racial, I guess you could say, background of his parents? And he felt that was a racially charged question, like I was being a racist or something like that, asking him this question. And what kind of relevancy does this have to who he is? And how he said that, I without breaking a smile, just shows that he has no insight into who he is, obviously, because your racial upbringing and how you're perceived, and one of the things I said is because he obviously has green eyes, and he even pointed this out. He says, well, obviously someone in my background was not, was mixed race, and that's where I got these eyes from. It's pretty obvious. I said, well, no, because you know what? When you're growing up with kids that make fun of each other and pick on each other and are cruel to each other, sometimes if you're an African-American man with green eyes, you could be considered somewhat of maybe an outcast in that society. I don't know. I don't know how he was perceived growing up, and that was a question I thought that was very relevant, because maybe he was perceived as one of the guys. I don't know, but maybe not. And that to me is very, very applicable to who he became later in life. How he can perceive that as a racial, negatively racial question, I have no idea. Ask Chris Aceto. Chris Aceto's married to an African-American woman, and they have biracial kids, and they're perceived completely differently. Chris sees people respond to him one way, his wife and kids another way. And that absolutely shapes and molds who you are later in life. How he can perceive that as a negative question, I have no idea. He also felt that the fact that I was asking him about gifted nutrition and what went on with that whole scene when he left Muscle Tech, went to Gifted Nutrition, and then had to leave his own company, why he felt that wasn't relevant. He said, well, it's all out there in court documents and press releases. Well, who cares? Press releases don't mean anything. They're just window dressing to make everything look great. I want to know how that mentally affected him as Mr. Olympia. Here he is preparing for the biggest show of his life, and he's dealing with stress of lawsuits and all kinds of craziness. He doesn't think that that's a relevant question as to how he responded and how he came out of that and what his mental toughness was like. That's what endears people to who you are as a person, how you overcome hardships and how you overcome uncomfortable situations in growing up, how you're perceived, how you perceive yourself. That's what makes you who you are. And the reason why people cannot relate to Phil Heath is because he will not reveal these things, because he doesn't think they're relevant. All right? Well, as an interviewer, that is relevant. What he felt was the most relevant question I should have asked him, and I can even take the quote from the video, was, how do you feel to be Mr. Olympia? Guess what, Phil? I don't need you to answer that question. It feels fucking great to be Mr. Olympia. And I'm sure every bodybuilder can attest to that. And I'm sure every Mr. Olympia can attest to that. I don't need you to tell me that. That's nothing monumental. No one cares about how you feel as Mr. Olympia, how it feels to be Mr. Olympia, because we know it feels fucking great. It's the greatest title in the world if you're a bodybuilder. That's what I call a softball question. That's lobbing you a softball. How it feels to be Mr. Olympia, what you're going to do with the title. That stuff we've heard 4,000 times from you. No new insight there. If that's what you wanted to answer in my interview, I didn't need to interview you, because you know what? They can watch every other interview out there that you answer that question every single time. And you're more than happy to talk about that because there's no emotional pain connected to that. So Phil turned me down, but you know what? I probably would have turned him down had he not allowed me to ask any of those questions. So I guess it was good that we didn't do the interview. But the bottom line is, the topic of today's rant is what makes a good interview. And a good interview is asking the uncomfortable questions. Not in a disrespectful way, and I never would do that. He knows I didn't. I gave him the questions. Asking questions that people want to know the answers to. Stuff that we don't know about you. Stuff that makes you who you are, how you tick, why you became the man you became later in life. And after all, that's what makes these reality TV shows so compelling and the #1 rated shows on TV now, because we all want to get behind the scenes. We don't want to know what the facade is that you present to the public. We want to know behind the scenes what goes on to make you who you are, because we know that life happens, relationships happen, arguments happen, drama happens, financial woes happen. That's what makes you who you are. Hey, I had a tough time this year and I had to work extra hard. I was really stressed out. This Olympia, I wasn't my best. Or maybe this Olympia, I was my best because I had to really buckle down and prove to myself that I could be better. That's what I want to hear. And that's what the audiences want to hear. And that's what makes a great interview. Dave Palumbo, RXMuscle.com.